Welcome to the 5th episode of the Hali Hewa Podcast with your host Abigael Kima. This podcast brings together key African players in the climate space to simply share their stories and their experiences as they advocate for climate justice in their unique capacities. Before I introduce our guest today, kindly support us by subscribing, liking, and sharing our content with your family and friends and your colleagues. And for the audio version of the podcast, find us on Spotify, Anchor, and Apple Podcast. And for the videos, you can find us on YouTube. And for regular updates on social media, you can find us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Hali Hewa Podcast on all social media platforms. Today on set, we have an amazing guest by the name Sofanit Mesfin from Ethiopia. Join us and let us learn more about what she does. She is the gender specialist working at the Regional Gender and Social Inclusion Coordinator at Ripple Effect, formerly known as Send a Cow. Ripple Effect works with smallholder farmers to equip them with knowledge and skills, enabling them to improve their livelihoods and to thrive. Farmers working alongside Ripple Effect learn more, grow more, and sell more. They can feed their families nutritious food, and by having a surplus to sell, can invest in their farms, send their children to school, and build sustainable agribusiness. Welcome to the Hali Hewa Podcast, Sofanit. It is very lovely to have you as a guest today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure too. So we've had conversations earlier on before, and this is luckily not our first time having a conversation, and I have learned a thing or two about the work that you do with the women farmers in across different African countries. So kindly tell us more about yourself and your work, and did you always want to work in the climate space, and what exactly inspires you to work on climate issues, and is there anything that you're really passionate about?
Yeah, so thank you. As you have already mentioned, my name is Sofanit Mesfin, and I'm the Regional Gender and Social Inclusion Coordinator. So my work is mainly related to improving the gender inequalities in rural Africa. So I work on bringing gender transformation, sustainable gender transformation, both at household and community level. So it is mainly, our projects are mainly implemented in East Africa. So we work in 6 different countries: Ethiopia, Kenya, Burundi, Rwanda, Uganda, and we also work through partners in Zambia. So my main work is mainly related to gender issues and resolving the gender inequalities that exist at the ground level. So when it comes to climate, it's not as such I was inspired to work on climate, but climate change is something that affects everyone. So my inspiration related to the climate change, it comes from after observing how the climate crisis affects the rural women in Africa. So I've seen the impact of climate change on women and men, and of course boys and girls. But I did see that it has impacted the women and girls, and it does impact women and girls disproportionately. So that's how I become inspired about the climate change.
Oh, great. Such an inspirational story, and it must be very interesting to work with rural women, because I luckily had an experience with them about a week ago, and I can tell just how passionate they are about really making a living for their families through farming. And so when we talk about the gender and climate crisis, UN Women has said that gender inequality coupled with the climate crisis is one of the greatest challenges of our time, and it not only poses threat to the way of lives and livelihoods, but also has an impact on the health, the safety, and the security for women and girls around the world. And when we speak about climate change and gender, we often hear that the impacts of climate change affects all gender differently, but that a disproportionate burden is being borne by women. So is this something that resonates with you, and is this what you have personally seen in the course of your work? When we say that women are disproportionately affected by the impacts of climate change, what exactly does that mean, and have you actually experienced that in your work?
Yeah. So Yes, I did experience that in my work. And when we say it disproportionately affects women and girls, as you can imagine, many of the women in that rural area are completely dependent on the natural resources, but they do have a limited access and control over those natural resources. So, for example, women are highly dependent on water, land, and also other natural resources, but with a very limited access and also control over those natural resources. So, because of these existing gender inequalities, and because of the low decision-making power when it comes to women in the rural area, they will be disproportionately affected by the climate crisis. So so this is one of the way how they will be impacted disproportionately by the climate crisis. The other one is whenever climate crisis happens, for example, if drought happens, there will be migration. So when people are forced to migrate, it's mainly the men that will migrate. So this will force the women to be at home and taking care of the whole family. If there are children, they will be responsible for the children. If there are elders in that home, they will be responsible to take care of those elders. So there will be a high workload on women during migration. And even if they migrate, they're not going to migrate by themselves. If there are children, they need to take care of those children while even in the course of migration. So this is another way that they will be impacted by the climate crisis disproportionately. And related to health, for example, if there is a shortage of water or lack of access to water, most of the reproductive health issues are related to hygiene and sanitation. If the women are pregnant, and if also related to girls and menstruation. So there are different ways that will be impacted by the climate crisis, which might not be the same case for men and boys. So this is also another way that they will be impacted by it disproportionately. The other thing is, most of the farmers are dependent on the agriculture. So whenever there is a climate crisis and when that hits, you will need to have different alternative income resources. So the women do also have a limited access when it comes to different income resources. So they will be disproportionately impacted by it because of the lack of diversified income. And even if they are participating on different income resources, because they're not deciding on the income that will be generated from different businesses. So they will be impacted by it disproportionately. So these are some of the ways that they will be impacted by climate crisis disproportionately. It could be either directly or indirectly. Uh, they will be indirectly disproportionately impacted by it.
Yeah, great. That is quite an insightful description of how women are directly impacted by the impacts of climate change. And a few weeks ago, I actually experienced being in a community where the men have actually migrated in search of pasture and water for the livestock, because it's a community that practices pastoralism as a main source of livelihood. And you can really tell that women have had now to step up and really try and find means of providing for their children, because they have children who are still going to school. They need to put food on the table, and the situation is really terrible because of the drought situation. And then you've also spoken about the health problems that women experience, especially with hygiene and sanitation during their menstrual cycles. And when there's no access to water, it means it actually puts them at a very bad situation. And I also actually got to experience that thanks to Ripple Effect, because I had an opportunity to speak to women, and they brought these issues quite clearly. So and then in our conversation earlier, you talked about intersectionality. So we have gender, and then there is the attributes or the qualities that goes beyond the gender aspect. So how do you deal with the intersectionality? For example, there's a woman, and apart from her being a woman, she's also a person living with disabilities. So how do you handle that in the work that you do?
Yeah, so when related to intersectionality, the more the intersectionality increases in a way, if you're a woman, that's one thing, but when you are a woman with disability, and if you are a young woman with disability, you will have a very limited access to information and a very limited access over natural resources and control over natural resources. So in our work, we try to make our work as inclusive as possible, try to make all different training materials, informations in our work, and try to adapt it so that people with different disabilities are able to access our work and are able to participate and engage fully in our work. So we have tried to adapt our work to be more inclusive. And I do also believe that the climate crisis will impact these people as the intersectionality increase. So if you are a woman with disabilities, there is a likely chance that your access to different information and mitigation and adaptation techniques and knowledge and skills will be limited. So we take into that account in our work, and everything that we do, we try to be more inclusive in our work.
Yeah. And I think inclusivity is such an important aspect when dealing with these issues because, again, we do realize that very different situations are different for different people, in that you can't really have one specific way of doing things when we know our experiences are so different among us communities. So I think that's a very important thing to do. So I've kept talking about my experience in the rural part of Western Kenya, which was quite an interesting one, and having conversations with women. So we traveled about 2 weeks ago to the rural part of Kenya called Busia and Bungoma to speak to rural women about their experiences and the impacts of climate change and how it has affected them, how it has affected their sources of livelihoods, and exactly what they're doing to cope with the changing climate and with the changing situations that they found themselves in now, owing to the climate crisis. And so I was speaking to the women, I noticed that they've actually taken it upon themselves to learn about the different technologies that are helping them adapt to the changing climate. And one interesting thing was that they actually organize themselves on weekly basis and meet and hold each other accountable and are actually coming together to, improve their lives. Most of these women have actually undergone training facilitated by Ripple Effect, formerly Send a Cow. So what is it like working with these women in the rural areas, and how do you conduct the training?
Yeah. So what we do with women is, first of all, we target, 65% of our target beneficiaries are women, and we do that deliberately because that's one of the ways that you will create access. So if we need to directly target women, and we also have a specific target for people with disabilities and young people, and that's the whole concept of inclusion. So it starts from targeting. And whenever we conduct training, we make sure that the trainings are accessible for women. So we choose times that are convenient for rural women. And we also are very conscious of the way we do trainings, making sure that everyone can understand our training. And that means also include seeing the inclusive aspect of giving training and demonstrating different parts of our training. For example, if there are people with hearing impairment, we'll try to hire people that have experience of interpreting, for people with hearing impairment, or if there are people with visual impairment, you'll try to speak at the training so that people with different issues can understand us and apply the knowledge that we are giving. So one of the things that we do related to training is making it more accessible for rural women. And we try to also to give training in a way using a very illiterate friendly training materials, because most of the rural women are illiterate. So we try to make our trainings practical as possible so that they can understand it easily. And that's also another way of doing our training. And we also combine our training with experience sharing visits, so that makes it more practical and effective. So these are some of the techniques that we use for training rural women on different issues, including climate crisis.
Yeah. Then I must say you guys are doing a really amazing job, because I also come from a community of farmers, and just being in those farms was also a mode of learning for me because of the different technologies, and those women are actually very passionate about this, and you can tell clearly that it has been quite transformative when it comes to increasing food production and also diversification of the kind of crops that they've been planting, because climate change has also, for example, one woman talked about how she used to plant maize for 2 seasons, but because of climate change she can only plant for 1 season. So during the other periods she changes and plants something different on her farm, for example, groundnuts, and it's still bringing income to her house, and she can take her kids to school, and she can also put food on the table. And when having conversations with these women, an interesting fact came up, which you've actually talked about. So, for example, when it comes to the issue of water shortages, they talked about how they had to travel, they have to wake up in the middle of the night to go get water, because during that time there are no long queues. So number one, that poses an issue of security for the women and the young girls, because now they have to go fetch water with their daughters. And then another issue that came up was the fact that it is also bringing conflict in the homes, being that when there's no water, it means there's hardly enough water to take a bath, especially for the men. And then there's also the issue where their clothes are actually not clean because of shortage of water. So they said that in such situations you find women will actually be beaten, because the men come off as, or rather they're misunderstood because of the situation. So have you actually dealt with an issue of gender-based violence related to the problems, the impacts of climate change, and how have you dealt with it in your work?
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought this. Yeah, so one of the things is related to gender-based violence, which is not something that you would think about when you think about climate change or access to limited water resources. But like you have exactly mentioned, and as you have heard it from the rural women, it's something that occurs. So in our work, what we do is we do try to change the gender relation at household level. So we have our own tool called transformative household methodology that was developed by Ripple Effect. So we implement this tool, and this is a very powerful tool that opens dialogue between family members. So as a result of this tool, one of the things that will happen is we will try to change the gender roles within the household. So to be more specific related to this issue, for example, related to the water issue, so that we will try to conduct that tool so that the men and the boys will be engaged also in collecting water. The reason is it's because only the women and the girls that are doing this. So after implementing that tool and creating that gender transformation, the men will help out also in collecting waters, and the girls and the boys will also help out in that way. So that's one of the ways that we will address this issue. The other way is we also work on developing springs so that we can make the water more accessible and near to the houses. But before even developing a spring, it doesn't matter if you develop the spring near to the houses. We need to tackle the gender issues because we need everyone to equally participate on different household chores. And that's one of the things that we do to combat the gender-based violence.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's quite an interesting tool, and honestly, just being in these communities and understanding exactly what you're doing with them is quite inspirational. And I feel like everyone should actually, follow you and see exactly what you're doing and get a clear understanding of the conversation of climate change and gender crisis and how it's affecting women, and also the things that we can learn from you based on what you're doing to actually bring transformation in our communities when it comes to gender and the climate crisis. And finally, as we wrap up on this segment, when we were having conversations with these women, towards the end, we'd ask them what they'd want to see done differently, either from the government or world leaders, because also explaining what COP27 is was a bit challenging. But now we talked about, the local governments, the MCAs, the county governments, that is easy for them to understand. And one of the things that they talked about was the importance of education and calling the government to actually bring more technology and tools that they can equip themselves to ensure that they increase their food production. And so they said not every person has been educated and a ripple effect, because again we understand capacity issues, but then they said maybe if the government comes through, they can have more people getting educated so that the entire community can be transformed. And you know, when a community is transformed, it means also the entire country will have an increase in the food production, and it will bring about food security. So with the work that you do with these communities across different countries, because I do understand that your experiences, say in Ethiopia, is also very different from your experiences in Kenya and say Rwanda and Burundi, which is where you work. So what kind of support would you say you need from governments or other stakeholders to ensure that more and more people are getting educated and are getting equipped with the skills necessary to improve their lives, especially those that practice agriculture? Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll start from the support from the government. I think it should start from having that gender lens when it comes to the climate crisis and the agriculture. So we need to see that the gender perspective in the rules and the regulations and in the policies, and we need to have that understanding that not everyone will be impacted equally by the climate crisis. So people will be impacted by the same case in a different way because of the existing gender relation, because of the culture, because of the practice in the rural Africa. So I would start from that. And I would also agree with the rural women is that knowledge is power. So we need to educate everyone on related to this issue, and also introduce agricultural technologies which are safe for the environment, but are accessible for everyone. Sometimes we could introduce different agricultural technologies, and if these technologies are not women friendly, if women cannot access them and operate them, there is no point of introducing these agricultural technologies. So if you introduce some agricultural technologies that will increase the food production, you need to make sure that people with different disabilities are able to access and operate this technology. So these things should be dealt with from the government perspective. And I'll also add that we need support from the government to make the natural resources more accessible, the water. So it's something that should be taken into account, and also work on policies and regulations related to land, in most of the Eastern Africa. I could say specifically for Uganda and Ethiopia, there is issue when it comes to land ownership and deciding on land related to women. So that's something that the government should take into account and work on. So these are some of the things that we need support from the government and other stakeholders.
Yeah, so partnership and collaboration with the government is such an important aspect to ensure that, we are building capacity and reaching everyone that should be reached to ensure that we all transform the society. So thank you so much for those very insightful information about what you do at Ripple Effect and the things that we could also do to support your work. And if we want to have a conversation with you, or if we want to reach you, say we want to conduct training in a different part of Kenya, because I understand you're only situated in Western Kenya, but you're looking to expand to other parts, and the issue of resources comes about. So what kind of if we want to reach you, where can we find you?
Yeah, so we have our website, ripplefix.com. You can reach us there. We are available on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. So you can find us and get connected with us in these social medias as well.
Okay, I will be sure to leave the links on the description bar once this episode is out. So moving on to the very last segment of this podcast, and we know throughout the series of this podcast we've been asking our guests what their call to action for COP27 is, and it's actually around the corner in a month's time or two. No, a month's time. So what would you say are your call to action for COP27 from an African perspective with regards to gender issues and the climate crisis? What do you want to see the world leaders deliver with regards to the work that you do with the women and gender in general?
Yeah, so I think from Africa's point of view, in a very general way, I think that finance is a major issue. So we will need to see the climate finance being implemented, and we will need the financial and technical support from the developed countries to the developing countries, because developing
Mm-hmm.
countries will be focusing on climate adaptation technique, and we will need the finance and technical support in order to implement this. And from the
Mm-hmm.
gender perspective, we need to see, and we need to, I would personally will need to see decisions related to climate change, keeping in mind that this thing will affect different people, different parts of the societies differently. So I would
Mm-hmm.
need to see the gender lens, the inclusion aspect related to all the decisions that will be made related to climate change. And the third thing is, I think water and agriculture is very essential. So my hope, and the I will be looking forward to see decisions related to COP27, related to making water more accessible, introducing safe agricultural technologies so that we can increase food production in Africa, and giving
Mm-hmm.
the adequate financial and technical support from developed countries so that we can combat climate change in
Mm-hmm.
general and make this planet a better place to live. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is nothing as important as water and having accessibility to, to water, because water is life, and also
Yeah.
accessibility to food, which I know is becoming such a big problem for Africa. And we are all looking to be secure when it comes to food. And I've really learned a lot through my experience with the women, and also speaking to you over the couple of months that we were in conversations. And I do hope to see you in Egypt if you are gonna be there. And I look forward to collaborating more with you as we go. So thank you so much for being such a lovely guest on the podcast. And for the viewers and the listeners, I hope that you will subscribe to our channel so that you can get more insightful conversations around the issues of climate and gender and everything else that is coming up along the way. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much.